let's talk about the Denver Nuggets. When you look at their last 2 years, you would think that moving into this year, they should be primed for another deep playoff run, potentially making it to the finals and being real true championship contenders. When you look back to 2 years ago, it was the first playoff appearance for this core group of Jamal Murray and Jokic together, alongside pieces like Paul Millsap, Gary Harris, etc. And they had kind of a rough time of things. Their first round matchup, the 2-7 matchup, was against the San Antonio Spurs, led by Derek White and DeMar DeRozan and LaMarcus, and of course Pop. You can't discount that, but that really wasn't a team that they should have had issues with, and they ended up going into a pretty tough Game 7 where they ended up pulling it out in the end, but it did not feel like a sure thing. Then they move into their next series against the Portland Trailblazers, who ended up winning that series, and it was another 7-game series. This one had two kind of defining moments, which was a 4-overtime Game 3 win for the Blazers in Portland at Moda, in which Jokic was gassed by the end, and that was really the deciding factor. And then a Game 7 loss where CJ McCollum put the game on ice with a beautiful step-back mid-range jumper. Going into this year, they had one of the best under-the-radar signings of the offseason, trading a second-round pick to the Oklahoma City Thunder for Jeremy Grant, who turned into a very, very good contributor for them. He started some games, came off the bench in other games, but when you think about Jeremy Grant, he's one of these just fantastic role players coming off of a good season with the Thunder, and he really helped bolster their defense and make them into a very, very good regular season team. Now, the big criticism of that team going into the postseason was, well, they don't have the guy who you can, put the ball in his hands in crunch time and say, go. They don't have a Damian Lillard. They don't have a Curry. They don't have one of the guys at that level in terms of creating and scoring with the ball in their hands. But going into the bubble and going into this bubble playoffs, Jamal Murray really stepped up and became that kind of player, that player who you can just give the ball to him on an island and say go to. And I think that was one of the biggest reasons that they were able to make their run. Obviously, they continued their pattern and had 2 7-game series in the first 2 rounds of this bubble playoffs, which included 2 pretty magnificent 3-1 comebacks, including a pretty awful collapse by the Clippers. But all of those, although Jokic was putting up stats and, he was magnificent and just played out of his mind, I think the real hero that everyone will look to for that playoff run will be Jamal Murray. He stepped up and showed that he deserved that big, I think it was $170 million contract that he earned last offseason, and there were a lot of times where he just took the team on his back and looked unstoppable, which was a new thing for this Nuggets team. Now, of course, they ran into the Lakers in the conference finals, which, you know how that turned out. LeBron did his thing, AD did his thing, including that really impressive game, I think it was Game 3 game winner, that three-pointer from the left elbow. And it can't have felt good for Nuggets fans, but that was an incredible run, and they came into this offseason as a young team that looked prime for great success. However, I really, really am not a fan of this offseason that they just had. When you look at players that left, they lost Mason Plumlee to the Pistons, Jeremy Grant to the Pistons, Torrey Craig to the Bucks, and Keita Bates-Diop to the Spurs. In return, they brought in J. Michael Green from the Clippers, Zeke Naji, a rookie out of Arizona, Marcus Howard, a rookie out of Marquette, Facundo Campazzo, a point guard from Real Madrid, who's 29. They re-signed Paul Millsap, as well as Bol Bol, and then they brought in Isaiah Hartenstein from the Rockets, Greg Whittington from overseas, and RJ Hampton in the draft. That, to me, does not look like a reasonable exchange for this Nuggets team. When you look into the players that they lost, Mason Plumlee was a guy who they acquired in a trade with the Blazers for Yusuf Nurkic a few years back, which ended up really benefiting both sides. The Nuggets didn't have room for Nurkic, and they needed somebody who was more equipped to being a kind of utility role player. And at the same time, the Blazers needed somebody who could, be a third piece to that offense. And both players really stepped into those roles very nicely. Mason Plumlee, throughout his time in Denver, he never averaged crazy numbers. 7 points, 5 rebounds, and 2.5 assists in this last season. But he's one of those guys that just has great intangibles. I mean, his pick and roll defense is very solid. His playmaking for a center is very solid. He's a great big to bring off the bench and to, just lock down that position for a little bit against other backups. Another big loss for them was Torrey Craig, somebody who was not a stat sheet stuffer, but this is a guy that I think any team can use. He's out of South Carolina Upstate, which I think is the smallest D1 basketball school, and he just scrapped. He's a wonderful on-ball defender, and that's something that I think they'll really miss. His three-point shooting was streaky at best, but for a guard, his rebounding at 3 rebounds per game was a huge boon, and he consistently gave them second possessions when it looked like, a dead play or anything like that. And then I think what people will look at as their biggest loss is Jeremy Grant. He really stepped up in this playoff run, especially in that Lakers series. He was giving guys like LeBron and Marcus Morris, or one of the Morris twins, real issues on the offensive end, and he really did as good of a job as you can on LeBron in a playoff series, and he was really impressive, and he ended up getting a ton of money for his effort. $60 3 years. The issue is that the people that they brought in to replace these guys, who for the most part are role players in almost every game, they'll have a breakout game here or there, but they're not who you would consider star players. The people who they brought in to replace these guys, I don't see any improvement. I actually see some loss in those areas, and that scares me, because I understand that they have a young core, but I think with the run they made last year, they are ready to be in win-now mode. And getting rid of guys that have been with you for playoff runs who are proven playoff performers and just level heads and all of that, and for the most part, replacing them with rookies just seems like it might make them take a step backwards. When you look at the young players that they're bringing in, Zeke Naji is somebody who I'm assuming they'll try and put in as a backup to Paul Millsap, who they re-signed, as kind of an interior-focused four. He's 6'11", 240, but I don't know if he has the defensive skill set to be an actual center in the league. And I think he'll more be kind of a more traditional four, operating on small ball fours in the post, getting rebounds, that sort of thing. They brought in Marcus Howard, who, if you have read my Instagram posts, I love. I think he's a very Trae Young-like scorer. I know that's the easy comparison, but it's just automatic from three, beautiful floaters, tight handle, good passing, all of that. But he is already 21. He is only 5'9", so he's even smaller than Trae is. And there's a potential he'll be just swallowed up in the NBA game, even though he averaged over 27 points per game in college. And then their other rookie is probably the one I'm most excited about. It's RJ Hampton from the New Zealand Breakers. He was such a highly regarded high school talent. For him to slip that far down the draft is something to consider, but I think it mostly had to do with his shot and his lack of a consistent shooting form. But when you look at a guy as athletic and just physically gifted as RJ Hampton, I think you can at the very least expect him to come in and be a pretty good defender off the bench. And, the Nuggets love these guys with high ceilings, and RJ Hampton is definitely one of those. Other than rookies that they've acquired, I don't know much about Facundo Campazzo, the guard out of Real Madrid. He is small at 5'11", 194 pounds. He's already 29, so he reminds me a little bit of Milos Teodosic, who the Clippers signed a few seasons ago, I think also from Real Madrid. An experienced guard, maybe can step into a similar role that Monte Morris plays now and just give them a few more ball handling and playmaking options off the bench. Bringing in J. Michael Green as what looks like a replacement for Jeremy Grant, I'm not a fan. Last season for the Clippers, he was pretty underwhelming at 7 points, 6 rebounds, and 1 assist with, in the games that I've watched, kind of a low amount of impact outside of what he's doing statistically. And then Isaiah Hartenstein, a guy that hasn't really proven anything. He's big, but he doesn't seem very strong for a center, and I worry that he'll just get pushed around on both sides of the ball. And then they brought in Greg Whittington, a ex-Georgetown player who's 27, just recently played 4 years overseas, including last year at Galatasaray, and in 10 games he averaged 12 points, 4 rebounds, and 2 assists. I don't really know how any of those non-rookie signings are going to give them any major positive impact. Now, they did re-sign Paul Millsap, which I think was important. He is 35, but last postseason he showed that he still has a lot left to give. And I think the floor stretching and just that veteran presence is something that they will continue to need this season. And so I like that deal. They also re-signed Bol Bol, and you're seeing reports that maybe he'll have a bigger role in the offense. I just don't really trust him yet. I have to see it to believe it. I mean, watching him at Oregon, he definitely had the talent, but he got injured within a month of playing and didn't seem to really want to come back, want to keep playing. So I worry both about his injuries and his push and his drive in the game. Also, he exploded onto the scene during the preliminary bubble games, which makes sense. I mean, who doesn't love a 7'2" guy making assists, hitting threes, all of that? But then I think everybody thought that he was going to play a pretty significant role as they got into actual games that counted, and he really didn't. And it's a little bit confusing why he didn't. I guess not to mess up rotations, but if he is this great talent like everybody's talking about, I would have hoped to see him at least some in that playoff run. And to expect him to come in and automatically just kind of pick up what Mason Plumlee was doing, not just on the stat sheet, but in terms of his off-ball defense and his just basketball IQ and all of that, I don't know if that's a good bet, and especially for a team that's wanting to compete now, that seems like a strange choice. Really, it seems weird to me that they are moving towards leaning on youth instead of these pretty solid role players who, yes, are veterans and don't necessarily fit the time frame of this core, but who are really producing a lot for you in your latest playoff run. I think the biggest place that this team has gotten worse this offseason is defensively. I look at their team and I see only one guy who is a real proven perimeter defender, and that is Gary Harris, and he is good, but I think of a playoff series against a Portland or a Golden State where you have that star guard who you need to slow down, and for the Nuggets last year, the answer was really consistently Torrey Craig, and without him, and with the inconsistency of Gary Harris, both offensively and injury-wise, I worry that they might get really demolished in some games by an opposing guard who heats up. And then in the front court, Mason Plumlee and Jeremy Grant were two very good team defenders. Jeremy Grant at times a very good on-ball defender as well. I don't trust a rookie to come in and immediately rectify that and do the same things that they were doing. I'm not necessarily saying that these rookies are going to be bad defensively, but for a team that's looking to compete, I just don't see it being a good choice. I think this season for the Nuggets, they'll still be a good regular season team. Jokic is a very good player, although I do worry about his weight and what that means for his injury problems down the road. But he is still going strong, and he is really a remarkable player. And, they still have that core. Will Barton wasn't with them in the bubble. That's some shot creation that they'll get back this regular season. And he had a very good year last year before getting injured. But I think this season really rests on Jamal Murray's shoulders. If he comes into this next season and plays like he did during the bubble, they will be a dangerous team. No matter what's happening defensively, no matter what. He was playing like an elite guard. And I'm not going to go overboard like some of these Instagram comments saying that, the top 3 guards in the NBA right now is Dame, Steph, and Jamal Murray. Like I'm not going that far, but he has immense potential, and he showed that he could execute at a really high level consistently in the bubble. Now we'll see once we get back to travel and all of that how that affects him, but if he's able to keep that up, I think they're another, second or third seed in the West, deep playoff run ready. But if he returns to the form that he's had the last few regular seasons, which is a little bit streaky, not necessarily that kind of really consistent scoring threat, I can see this team taking a serious dip and not being as much of a contender as I think would be expected after their last 2 years.